Seele, with the launch of characters like Jingliu, a lot of people have been questioning, is she still worth getting? Is she worth investing into? Is her light cone worth it? Is she overall still a good character even now, as destruction has been getting better and better with the release of characters like Blade and Viability Lunai? This is my Seele. I've invested heavily into her. She's E2, S1, with her traces completely maxed out, even the basic attack that you will never use. She has a fully built up and geared set. This is only level 14 because I gave Jingliu the level 15 variation of it. Jingliu, for instance, is S1. Her light cone, only super position 1. Eidolons, she's at E0. For comparison, I've invested into characters like Blade at E0 S1. I've invested into characters like Dan Heng or Viability Lunai at E2 S1. So I have a variety of different DPSs, Jing Yuan, Kafka, and so on. I even invest into characters like QQ and Clara. So I have a variety of characters, even my Yensheng here. He's built up, I adore him. Is Seele worth it? First off, if you lack a DPS, the answer is going to be yes. Yes, I understand. She's a hunt character, primarily single target. This means that she's not necessarily going to have the AoE potential of destruction units or the AoE potential of erudition units. Don't get me wrong, I understand. Erudition as of right now isn't in the best spot. Our only essential prime example of an erudition unit is Jing Yuan, and he fell off pretty quickly. But outside of that, Seele being single target oriented has locked her out of the same damage potential of characters like Blade or Lunai or Jingliu. And I understand for a lot of you that might be a big concern. You may want a character who has AoE DPS potential. Even Fu Xuan, for instance, has more AoE potential, though a lower damage ceiling. Does this make her a bad character? Well, the answer is no, but I don't want to just give you a solid no or yes. I do want to delve more in depth into why I think people are having these issues with her, and why I think it's kind of worth considering if getting eidolons on her is as valuable as a character like Fu Xuan, a Silverwolf, or any other support you may want. I've mentioned numerous times, Seele as a character does not have the same flexibility within her light cone as characters like Jingliu, Fu Xuan, Blade, or anyone else. Even if you're looking at Yanqing, I don't have a signature light cone. Even if you're looking at his signature light cone though, it is more flexible than Seele's own. The reasoning is, even though the 18% crit is nice, Seele needs 160 speed to max out the bonus effect, whereas nobody else needs that. Yes, I understand Jingliu is essentially perfectly fine with this. I understand many characters like Blade and Viability Lunai won't be draining HP from their party members, so as a result they may not get this bonus. But at E0, Jingliu can reach this potential pretty easily. Seele's light cone, depending on your build and depending on how easy it is for you to reach that speed, may have difficulties reaching 160 speed. At E2, she's getting about 50 speed. No matter what, you're always reaching that full potential. But it just may be a thing you might have to worry about depending on how you build her, especially if you have invested into attack boots over speed boots. If you got speed boots, you're fine no matter what. But just something to consider. She also does not scale as heavily as characters like Jingliu. If you get E1, E2, E3, all of these eidolons benefit Jingliu far more than a Seele will benefit from E1, 2, and 3. One of the reasons for this is all of Jingliu's eidolons are crit damage and attack, damage bonus, and then scaling, whereas Seele gets crit under specific circumstances, speed, which she doesn't necessarily get more damage from, it's just additional actions, and then scaling. Blade, this here, more damage based on HP. Crit, that's basically non-conditional because it's always in this state, and then scaling. Even if I'm looking at Yensheng, a standard banner character, additional damage. Even though it's frozen enemies, it's additional damage, so yes, it's conditional. Energy regen, meaning more ult, which gives you the crit damage bonus, and then scaling. Seele is a character whose eidolons are beneficial to her, but she doesn't necessarily have the ease of use and the high scaling potential that units like Jingliu and Blade have because she doesn't buff herself. If I'm looking at her kit, I'm looking at the eidolons and traces you have access to, yes, you get action toward, but you aren't going to be basic attacking with this character. Yes, her bonus ability reduces the chance of being hit, but with the introduction of characters like Fu Xuan, or introduction of characters like Lynx who change aggro priorities, she won't be getting hit too often anyway, especially if you have a Silverwolf. If anyone in the game has played with either Nihility characters or any of the Fox-based characters, you know aggro sucks for them because they will always be hit, even over characters like Clara, who actively want to be hit. So if we're looking at these traces, two of them aren't really useful for you. And the quantum resistance penetration is nice, but you get this from the set. You can arbitrarily get something vaguely similar to this by using a Silverwolf to debuff, or a Pela to debuff. And so, as a unit, she doesn't have the same bonuses in her traces that characters like Jingliu have, which is ult damage, which is effect resistance. Even though effect resistance doesn't necessarily equal more damage, it equals you not getting debuffed, and that's an incredibly valuable thing. I'd rather have effect resistance over just a slight change in targeting priorities when I'm low on HP, because ideally you don't want your characters to be below 50% anyway. And so, Seele does not scale as hard or as well as other units, and that's important to consider. If you're looking for a character who's easy to build, I legitimately would tell you that basically every DPS released after Seele is easier to build. In Viability, even though I don't use, the full imaginary sets, this set specifically is wonderful for easily building him up with crits. He has access to great buffers like Yukong, who's somewhere in here. Even if I'm looking at his light cone, less conditional, but overall more beneficial. If I'm looking at his traces, crit damage. Let's ignore this and say the enemy isn't weak to imaginary. Cool beans. You still have damage percent here. You still have additional crit damage. So as a unit, he scales better and is easier to build just even without considering relics and light cones. Seele has a harder potential and has a harder time reaching this threshold. And so, as a unit, yes, she's going to perform wonderfully. As a unit, she's going to be doing great, and Mono Quantum is in a wonderful position as of right now, but she's not going to beat out characters like Jingliu, characters like Mbappe Lunai, and she's been reduced on the tier list because of that. And unfortunately, I can agree. I've used Jingliu, I've used Mbappe Lunai, and I understand my position is these characters have eidolons now, they have the light cones, cool beans, great. But if I'm looking at them just from the potential they have, Seele is single target. A lot of times you'll be facing off against 1 to 2 big bosses in MOC, and occasionally, yeah, you may have that one Yanqing, you may have that one Kafka, cool. But without the ability to stop her from being targeted actively with a debuff like Kafka's mind control, or to stop her from being frozen or imprisoned, and without the ability to buff her damage to the extent that either one of these two characters have, she's going to fall off. Because if you are considering getting this character, and let's say you're looking at all the 5 stars at a baseline E0 DPS, then Seele is arguably going to be worse long term. Because I like to consider what potential maximum damage can you get out of these characters if you were to eventually invest into eidolons. And if you were to do that, Seele does not benefit that much. She gets a lot of damage out of it, but it's not going to be the same damage as a Jingliu, the same damage as a Blade. Even if, let's say hypothetically, she surpasses your Blade is far more survivable in basically any scenario with self-healing and with high amounts of HP and tankiness built into his kit. Even if she surpasses Mbappe Lunai, theoretically, he's a character who automatically gets more actions, and even though he consumes equivalent skill points, has an easier time damaging more enemies. And so, even though she could have, let's say, the highest damage in the game, she's single target. And characters who can hit multiple enemies in a game where the endgame content is focused on hitting multiple bosses, 2 to 3, or maybe even if we're looking at Simulated Universe with Swarm, a big boss that splits and multiplies constantly, she's going to struggle with that content. And yes, this can be mitigated with characters like Silverwolf, this can be mitigated with the sub DPS, but it's something to consider if I'm looking at the raw investment it would require to have a Seele team equal out to a Jingliu team. My main question in response to that would be, why would you invest into that character, into that team, when you could otherwise get a different unit up earlier on with less difficulty and have a higher potential DPS down the line? So, is Seele good? Yes. Is she the best summon for your account? Probably not. I'd say that there are other more valuable characters, especially with Jingliu right now. You don't have to like her character. I don't like either one of their characters. I like Jingliu's design more. Seele's gameplay is a bit more fun. But beyond that, I'd say from a raw damage and a raw value perspective, Seele is good, but she's not as great as she was, I'd say, a patch ago. And Mbappe Lunai was essentially competition, but Jingliu as a different character knocked her out, especially given Jingliu has access to Mono Ice. If you really wanted to run that team, you don't have to, you can. Seele as a character severely falls off strictly, I'd say, just because she doesn't buff herself to the same extent they do. Yes, I understand Resurgent is a buff, but it is not a crit of 50% buff. It is not an immense attack buff. It is not an immense action forward buff. And that's a problem. So give me your thoughts down below. Will you be pulling for her? Will you be going for eidolons? I'd say if you want to get eidolons, cool. They're not bad. But understand that the character you're investing into is not as strong as some of the currently releasing units at E0. It's more competitive down the line, but it's still worth keeping in mind. Either way, if you enjoyed, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.